So now that we've got a good start on our audience animation, we have our crowd paying close attention to our animated character as he climbs up and jumps off the diving board. It's now time to focus on shot one. So with shot one, this is where we're going to bring a camera into the scene, and we're going to have the camera basically sweep across all of our characters that are sitting out there in the stands. And these guys need to look all animated, happy, and excited. But for us to put this shot together, we really do need to refer back to our storyboards to make sure that we are following the instructions, if you will, because storyboards are nothing more than a series of instructions. Yeah. The instructions that were approved at the very beginning of this project.
And so here we have in Photoshop our first storyboard describing shot one. And we can see our audience sat on the bleachers. So this gives us an idea of the camera angle. We're down in the audience. We're looking directly at the audience. And it says here that we've got lots of bounce and stretch commotion. So we know that we're going to use our automatic squash and stretch, the animation we set up on our audience, and we need to make sure that that is active for this shot. And it says that the camera will track right across the crowd of bulls. The crowd cheers throughout, so that's all that squash and stretch animation, then calms at the end of the pan, preparing for the show. So that calm, we're going to take advantage of that overall control parameter we built in the first volume of the TD series, and we're going to drop that down towards 0 so that the crowd will settle down towards the end of that pan. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to create our camera. We're going to get it positioned so that we're looking at the audience composed in a similar sort of way to this storyboard. Then we're going to set up that track, that pan across the audience as the camera moves from the left column of audience all the way around to the right. Once we've got that in place, we can then take a look at our audience animation, set up some parameters, and set up, we're going to have to deal with our audience look at a little bit as well, because for this shot we want the audience to look at the camera, not necessarily at our character. So with that, let's jump over into Houdini and get our camera created. So over in Houdini, at the object level, I'm going to create a camera. I'm just going to push enter to create the camera at the origin. And I'm going to push W to jump over to wireframe, space 2 to jump up to a top view. I'm going to grab our camera and I'm going to move it so that it's positioned roughly above the pool, because that's going to be positioned nicely to give us a good coverage of our bleachers. If we rotate about a point, because the only animation this camera is actually going to do is rotate in Y, we're going to be able to rotate and look at all of the audience. Also, we're close enough to the audience that we'll be able to get a composition something like this. So let's jump over and set, if we jump over to a perspective view, set our camera in terms of translate Y so that it's actually up off of the ground. I'm going to right click on the handle and align it with world to allow me to continue changing in translate Y. And then finally I'm going to kill my rotate values to 0, 0, 0 to begin with. And if we look through our camera, we'll see that we're looking at our audience, and if we're to rotate in Y, as we do so, we're going to pan across the audience. Of course, we want to start by looking at this column of the audience. And I'm also going to take off of translate Y, bringing us down so that we're looking at the entire audience and not having too much empty space at the top of our frame. So let's tweak our rotate to give us a nice composition. So with that in place, I'm going to jump to the first frame of our animation, and I'm going to key our rotate Y value. We then know that this first shot is going to take 220 frames. We set aside 220 frames before our character animation starts, purposely for this shot. So what we can do, we can jump to frame 220, and we can change our rotate Y value such that we're now swept across and looking at the other end of the bleachers. So let's pan across the audience to look at our other column on the right hand side. And that's going to give us, our animation is going to be fairly slow to cook because the audience is animated. But that's going to give us our camera animation that was described over on that storyboard, the pan across the audience going from left to right. So with that in place, we can now take a look at some of our audience's animation controls. So let's jump over to our bleachers, jump inside, and on the audience tab of our bleachers asset, we have the animation tab. And currently we've got whatever we had left off when we were just playing around setting up the animation. I've gone ahead and got some parameters that I feel work fairly well. So I'm going to give a speed of 0.18, a minimum amplitude of negative 0.1 because we want a small amount of squashing down, but nothing too extreme, because really we're interested more in the audience jumping than squashing, and the jumping is achieved through the stretch. And the stretch I'm going to leave at 1.29. With the overall control, we're going to have the first shot, the audience are kind of excited, but they're not as excited as when the ball's going to jump off of the diving board into the pool. So I'm going to set it to 0.8 for now, so we're kind of at like 80% of our excitement. And then I'm going to tail that off towards the end of this shot down towards 0, and then when the character dives off of the diving board, since we're dealing with this parameter, I'm going to boost it up to 1 so that the audience are really excited once the character is diving into the pool. So let's key this with a value of 0.8 on frame 1, and then let's jump towards the end of the first shot, so let's say to somewhere around frame 170, and key this again by alt left clicking to set another key at 0.8, and then by the end of this animation, so this shot finishes at frame 220, so let's say by frame 200, I'm going to tail this off towards, I don't know, very close to 0, but not quite 0. The very small value, these guys are going to still be moving very slightly. We may not even notice it in the render, who knows. It's going to be a very small amount, but it's enough that they're not completely static. They are moving a little bit, almost like an audience would be, they're going to be breathing, they may be talking very quietly, they're going to be moving a little bit. So that's going to give us a full audience animation for the beginning of the shot, and then it's going to tail off towards the end of the shot. Now I am going to jump out so that we're not looking through our camera and find where our ball is diving off the diving board. So I'm going to jump up, hide out our bleachers so we get nice feedback, scrub to where the ball is about to dive off of the diving board, and at about this point we're going to ramp up the audience so that they then are onto full animation. So here I'm going to key this again at 0.04, and then as the character goes up and begins his descent, I'm going to key this up at 100% of animation, so for the final part of the animation, the audience are extremely excited. So that's great. We've got the squash and stretch part of the animation set up, but we do have an issue with where the audience are looking for that initial shot. The audience are looking at this knoll, but our camera is here, so let's look through our camera and find towards the end, and if we do a quick render we'll see very clearly what the issue is. So our audience are looking off to the character which is to our right now, so if we were to do a render of this view, we're going to see that the audience aren't looking at the camera, but are rather looking off to the right of the screen. So if we just give this a second to render. This isn't ideal. We want the audience to be looking at our camera. We can also see that we can see the pool in the shot, so let's move our camera up in Y very slightly. So let's jump up, grab our camera and translate that up in Y just until, if we bring a shaded view in, just until the pool is out of our shot. So that should be perfect there.
Yeah, it looks good.
Fantastic. So going back to the other issue, we've got our audience who are looking at our character. Now we've got this look at offset parameter on our bleachers, so we could change our look at offset in X and slightly in Y to bring the actual position that the audience are looking at to where our camera is. But how do we go about working out what this distance is and the distance in Y between this point and this point? Well, it's actually rather simple. We can jump back up to object level, and we've got our audience look at null. So what if we were to wire another null as a child of this null? What's going to happen there, we'll see that if we right click on the output of our audience look at and create another null, and this is just a temporary null, we're going to see that it's in the exact same position as our audience look at null, but its translations, if I can get to see all of its translations. Okay, so we have finally got Houdini to give us back our translation values, and as I was about to say, our translation values are 0, 0, 0, even though the position is in the exact same location as our original audience look at, which has a value of 14.04, 7 point something, and 0. Why is this? It's because it's a child of this object. So as a child, if it has a 0, 0, 0, that 0, 0, 0 position is relative to our parent's position, which means at 0, 0, 0, we are in the same position as our audience look at. What does this enable us to do? It enables us to take this null and move it to where we want our audience to actually be looking at. So let's hunt down our camera. So let's switch over to a top view, push W, and move this to our camera, and then space 3 to jump over to a side view, and move this up to meet with our camera. And what that means is now we have these translation values that are a relative offset from where the audience is currently looking. We need to move negative 32 units in X and up 3.9 units in Y, so that to get from where the audience are currently looking to where we want them to be looking at. So we can take this information and we can use it on the bleachers asset for the look at offset. Also bearing in mind that we still need to keep the positive 13 point something that we already had in X to account for the translation of the bleachers at object level. So let's grab this 32.7239 and Control C to copy it, and jump down inside our bleachers. And here we've got the look at offset. Well, let's take the 13.1168 and add to that a negative 32.7239, or in other words, let's subtract 32.7239. And that's going to now give us an offset that's over here. Well, that's great, except for we do need to switch back to looking at the character. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab the offset as well for Y. Then we're going to set a key somewhere where we know that we're not going to be looking at the audience. And over a period of 1 frame, we're going to switch from this offset over to our original offset. So let's just jump back up to object level and grab the translate Y value. Control C to copy that. Jump into our bleachers, and in the Y offset, Control V to paste. So I'm going to move to frame probably 230. Because at frame 230 or around about, we've just finished that initial 220 frames of the pan across the crowd. So we're going to be on shot 2. If we jump over to Photoshop and find our shot 2, we'll see that we're looking away from the crowd. We're looking back at the character, so we can't see the crowd in this shot. This is the only shot that's going to occur at frame 228, which means that we can switch from the audience looking at the camera, which is great for our first shot, over to the audience looking at our character, so that when we then do switch back to shot 3 and shot 4 and see the audience, they're going to be looking at our character. So I'm going to jump back over to Houdini, and I'm going to key, Alt left click to key our look at offset in X, Y, and Z at frame 228. I'm then going to switch to frame 229, and I'm going to set our Y to 0, and I want to jump up and find our translation in X for the bleachers at object level. Control C to copy that. Jump back in and set our look at offset in X to be the inverse of that, so a positive 13.1168, which is what it was originally. That's okay, I was actually changing the value, but I had an expression in it. So if we just delete out the negative 30 something and push enter, that will set a key at 13.1168. So that means that coming up to frame 228, we have our offset that's going to position us for the camera. And as we switch to frame 229, we've now got our offset we need for the looking at the character. Which means if we were to bring up our camera and choose any frame, let's choose a frame near the end again because we know that we saw the audience looking at to the right. You also notice that from time to time there's going to be rotations on the camera that in the viewport cause this weird glitch where everything goes black. To prove that this is just in the viewport, let's actually render this frame. This will prove perfectly for what we need. If we render this frame, you're going to see that in the render everything is fine. It's just a weird glitch in the viewport with Houdini. You also notice the audience are looking at us, which is fantastic. So with that, we're pretty much done. I want to do one last thing, and that's to jump up to object level and rename our camera to shot 01, just so our camera is named logically with what we're doing. And with that, that's going to wrap up the audience's animation. Thanks a lot.